Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is August 6, 2022. In this video, we're going to talk about the war in Ukraine, and more specifically, the possibility of a wider war, and what should be the position of communists to take in such a situation, as far as advising, preparing, and leading the working class out of the era of capitalist aggression, which of course is only going to happen through socialist revolution. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. You can find a link to Patreon in the video description. So to help prepare for the video, not just to help myself prepare, but to also help you, the audience, prepare, I have uploaded this weekend 7 short videos from Lenin, audiobooks and discussions of Lenin works. The videos are between 10 and 30 minutes each, regarding nationalism and war. So Lenin wrote extensively about World War I. In fact, it was World War I that wore the Russian government down to a point where the Bolsheviks were able to wage a successful revolution. Although, just simply having your bourgeois government worn down by war isn't enough to automatically have a revolution. You still need good, competent leadership that doesn't end up selling out and siding with the bourgeoisie, as many socialist parties did during World War I. This, of course, led to the collapse of the Second International, and after the dust settled, Lenin and the Bolsheviks set up the Comintern, the Third Communist International, to lay some new ground rules on what it meant to be a socialist, a Marxist, in the new era. So those videos are The Working Class and the National Question, more about nationalism, the European War and International Socialism, the tasks of revolutionary social democracy in the European War, the war and Russian social democracy, principles involved in the war issue, and To the Workers Who Support the Struggle Against the War and Against the Socialists Who Have Sided with Their Governments. Of course, there are longer Lenin texts, for example, The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, but in any case, I really counsel people, do the reading before you claim to have a Marxist-Leninist position. You can also look at texts like The Defeat of One's Own Government in the Imperialist War by Lenin, which is also available here on the channel. And when Lenin says the defeat of one's own government, this is directed to all workers in all the capitalist countries. In other words, you don't just want the other bourgeois government to defeat your government. That's not what it's about. If you try to argue that, people will know immediately, who actually have done the reading, that you are making stuff up, and you will look like a jerk, and people will tell you to get lost, and maybe come back after you've actually done the reading and can participate in a discussion of Marxism-Leninism. If I sound testy about this, it's because there's a whole lot of that going around. And if you think I sound testy, go read the Lenin works, because he wasn't exactly ecstatic about the opportunism that basically did collapse the Second International. So the position is the workers of every country should oppose the bourgeoisie of every country. Don't fight other workers, fight the bourgeoisie. We want the complete abolition of capitalism worldwide, and imperialist war can be converted into a revolution for that purpose. However, this takes a huge amount of preparation and organizing. It's not as simple as just tweeting out a hashtag. Parties have to engage with the masses on this issue and bring about the capacity and the will to do it. So we mentioned parties that have sold out and endorsed the bourgeois governments or engaging in social patriotism, etc. There is still a lot of that today. However, we're going to look at 2 statements from communist groups that, at least in terms of the words that they endorsed, don't seem entirely useless. Now, this was also a problem back in Lenin's time 100 years ago, that they can say one thing and then end up doing something else when push comes to shove. But, for now at least, they have taken some actually correct positions. What we do with that in terms of building up these parties and expanding the influence of those parties over the working class by deepening the relationship between the parties and the working masses, etc. Those are questions for each of the parties to resolve as far as their own relationships with the working class in their area. But anyway, let's turn now to the first statement. This is dated February 24, 2022. This was originally posted at solidnet.org. Title is Ukraine War, Joint Statement of Communist and Workers' Parties, No to the Imperialist War. No to the imperialist war in Ukraine. An independent struggle is needed against monopolies and bourgeois classes, for the overthrow of capitalism, for the strengthening of the class struggle against imperialist war, for socialism. Point 1. The Communist and Workers' Parties signing this joint statement are opposed to the imperialist conflict in Ukraine, which constitutes one of the consequences of the tragic situation for the peoples shaped after the overthrow of socialism and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Both the bourgeois and the opportunist forces. Comment. So just to review, what's opportunism? It's when you are proletarian, but you align with the bourgeoisie. You work with classes that you do not share class interests with. You basically compromise your own interests. Continuing. Which for years have fought against the USSR and recently celebrated the 30th anniversary of its dissolution, silencing the fact that the restoration of capitalism meant the dismantling of historic workers' and people's achievements and brought the peoples of the USSR back to the era of class exploitation and imperialist wars, are completely exposed. 2. The developments in Ukraine, which are taking place in the framework of monopoly capitalism, are linked to the US, NATO, and EU plans, and their intervention in the region in the context of their fierce competition against capitalist Russia for the control of the markets, raw materials, and transport networks of the country. These pursuits are concealed by imperialist powers, which are in conflict, promoting their own pretexts, such as defending democracy, self-defense, and one's right to choose their alliances, the compliance with the UN or OSCE principles, or supposedly fascism, while deliberately detaching fascism from the capitalist system that gives rise to and utilizes it. 3. We denounce the activity of fascist and nationalist forces in Ukraine, anti-communism, and the persecution of communists, the discrimination against the Russian-speaking population, the armed attacks of the Ukrainian government against the people in Donbass. We condemn the utilization of reactionary political forces of Ukraine, including fascist groups, by the Euro-Atlantic powers for the implementation of their plans. In addition, the anti-communist rhetoric against Lenin, the Bolsheviks, and the Soviet Union, to which the Russian leadership resorts to justify its own strategic plans in the region, is unacceptable. However, nothing can tarnish the enormous contribution of socialism in the Soviet Union, which was a multinational union of equal socialist republics. 4. The decision of the Russian Federation to initially recognize the, quote, independence of the so-called People's Republics in Donbass, and then to proceed to a Russian military intervention, which is taking place under the pretext of Russia's, quote, self-defense, the, quote, demilitarization, and, quote, defascistization of Ukraine, was not made to protect the people of the region or peace, but to promote the interests of Russian monopolies in Ukrainian territory, and their fierce competition with Western monopolies. We express our solidarity with the communists and the peoples of Russia and Ukraine, and we stand on their side to strengthen the struggle against nationalism, which is fostered by each bourgeoisie. The people of both countries, who lived in peace and jointly thrived in the framework of the USSR, as well as all other peoples, have no interest in siding with one or another imperialist or alliance that serves the interests of the monopolies. 5. We highlight that the illusions fostered by bourgeois forces claiming that there could be a better security architecture in Europe by EU intervention, NATO, quote, without military plans and aggressive weapon systems in its territory, a, quote, pro-peace EU, or a, quote, peaceful multipolar world, etc., are highly dangerous. All these assumptions have nothing to do with reality and are misleading for the anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist struggle, seeking to cultivate the perception that, quote, peaceful imperialism might exist. However, the truth is that NATO and the EU, like any capitalist transnational union, are predatory alliances with a deeply reactionary nature that cannot become pro-people and will continue to act against workers' and people's rights and the people's, that capitalism goes hand in hand with imperialist wars. quick comment there. Sometimes you hear libertarians talking about capitalism without war, that libertarians are anti-capitalist, but they're also for incredibly deregulated capitalism. That's not possible for reasons explained above. This is key when we're trying to beat back right-wing pretenders to be anti-war. That's not possible because capitalism goes hand in hand with imperialist wars. Once capitalism develops to a certain point, that's just the way it goes. Continuing. 6. We call on the peoples of the countries whose governments are involved in the developments, especially through NATO and the EU, but also Russia, to struggle against the propaganda of the bourgeois forces that lure the people into the meat grinder of imperialist war using various spurious pretexts, to demand the closure of military bases, the return home of troops from missions abroad, to strengthen the struggle for the disengagement of the countries from imperialist plans and alliances such as NATO and the EU. 7. The interest of the working class and the popular strata requires us to strengthen the class criterion for analyzing the developments, to chart our own independent path against monopolies and bourgeois classes, for the overthrow of capitalism, for the strengthening of the class struggle against imperialist war, for socialism, which remains as timely and as necessary as ever. That's the end of the statement. Now the list of communist and workers' parties that signed this joint statement. The Algerian Party for Democracy and Socialism, the Communist Party of Azerbaijan, the Party of Labour of Austria, Communist Party of Bangladesh, Communist Party of Belgium, Communist Party of Canada, Communist Party in Denmark, Communist Party of Denmark, Communist Party of El Salvador, Communist Party of Finland, Communist Party of Greece, Communist Party of Kurdistan, Iraq, Workers' Party of Ireland, Socialist Movement of Kazakhstan, Socialist Party of Latvia, Communist Party of Malta, Communist Party of Mexico, New Communist Party of the Netherlands, Communist Party of Norway, Palestinian Communist Party, Communist Party of Pakistan, Paraguayan Communist Party, Peruvian Communist Party, Philippines Communist Party, PKP 1930, Communist Party of Poland, Romanian Socialist Party, South African Communist Party, Communist Party of the Workers of Spain, Sudanese Communist Party, Communist Party of Swaziland, Communist Party of Sweden, Syrian Communist Party, Communist Party of Turkey, Union of Communists of Ukraine, Communist Party of Venezuela. Then the list of communist youth organizations signing the joint statement. Youth Section of the Party of Labour of Austria, Bangladesh Youth Union, Young Communists of Belgium, Communist Youth of Bolivia, Communist Youth Union Czech Republic, Communist Youth of Denmark, Communist Youth of the Communist Workers' Party Finland, Union of Communist Youth France, Communist Youth of Greece, Communist Youth of Guatemala, Connolly Youth Movement Ireland, Workers' Party Youth Ireland, Front of the Communist Youth Italy, Front of the Communist Youth Mexico, All Nepal National Free Students Union, Communist Youth Movement Netherlands, Democratic Students Federation Pakistan, Democratic Youth Front Pakistan, Palestinian Communist Youth, Paraguayan Communist Youth, Union of Socialist Youth Romania, Revolutionary Communist Youth League Bolsheviks Russia, Collective of Young Communists Spain, Socialist Students Union Sri Lanka, Socialist Youth Union Sri Lanka, Communist Youth of Sweden, Leninist Communist Youth Union of Tajikistan, Communist Youth of Turkey, League of Young Communists USA, Communist Youth of Venezuela. Then the list of other parties that signed the joint statement. The Movement Che Guevara, Union of Communists in Bulgaria. The Road of Independence, Turk Chypriot Party, Cyprus. Communist Front, Italy. Communist Workers' Party for Peace and Socialism, Finland. Communist Revolutionary Party of France, PCRF. People's Liberation Front, JVP, Sri Lanka. Swiss Communist Party. So there's a statement that is brief. I think it's on point, and I think that these many parties and groups were on the right track with that. So what I'd like to follow this with, and what was actually the impetus for this video, is a statement from one of the signatories of that, the Union of Communists of Ukraine, certainly relevant considering what is happening in Ukraine right now, titled On War and the Tasks of the Working Class, It was a statement and analysis by the Union of Communists of Ukraine, originally appearing in the Russian language at solidnet.org, June 27, 2022. It's the first public statement of the Union of Communists about the imperialist war in Ukraine, while the Communist Party of Ukraine has not so far issued any communique. Both political forces have been banned in Ukraine and are currently facing multiple persecutions. So we're going to read the statement in just a minute. Before we do that, I just want to point out and contrast, first of all, this is not the Communist Party of Ukraine, KPU. It is another group that was founded basically at the same time, December 1992. Initially, there was some cross-membership or dual membership, but then the parties grew apart. In 2015, Ukraine passed decommunization laws that banned both parties. However, both parties have continued to exist and to do various activities, even though they do not enjoy full legal status. So what is the difference? Who are these UCU? Is it just, two guys in a closet? No, they are active in a network that was set up by the Greek Communist Party, which I think is fairly widely recognized as one of the better, more active communist parties in the world today. The name of that group or alliance is Initiative, the Initiative of Communist and Workers' Parties. It has 30 member parties from all over Europe. And these tend to be more kind of next-gen parties. It's not necessarily the more established boomer parties. For example, in France, the PCF is not a member, but the Communist Revolutionary Party of France is, as is the Pole of Communist Revival in France. So I think that that's what you find, not necessarily universally, but it kind of looks to me like that is the tendency. It's newer communist parties. So like I just mentioned, the PCRF, I believe they were founded in 2016, and the Pole of Communist Revival in the mid-2000s. So similar to the UCU, which was founded in the early 90s, and which has had various relationships with other newer communist groups in, for example, Russia, where people may be familiar with the largest group, the KPRF or CPRF, Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which does have some seats in the government, but which many people criticize as tailing Putin and not being critical enough of the Russian bourgeois government generally, though my understanding is that there are some good people in there as well. We're talking about sort of overall tendencies of a party or general impressions that people get of a large group of people and sort of the, majority of the activity. Anyway, but, you may be familiar with that. There are also smaller groups which are also communist, but want to be independent from the KPRF for various reasons. One example is the Russian Communist Workers' Party, which the UCU is said to be close with. So just so people know, there's not necessarily just one communist group in a country, and the largest one is not necessarily the best one. We should also give our attention to these smaller groups, especially at a time when there is so much stagnation and opportunism, and, in my opinion, the need for a revival and revitalization of the movement. All right, so let's get into the UCU's statement. The general assessment of the nature of the war, launched under the guise of a special military operation, SMO, by the Union of Communists of Ukraine, UCU, generally coincides with the statement of the Communist and Workers' Parties of February 24, 2022, which was supported by the UCU. It's the statement we just read. In this war, two imperialist groups of world capital collided in Ukraine: the International Capitalist Alliance of Countries led by the USA and NATO, and the International Capitalist Alliance of Countries led by Russian state monopolistic capital. A number of major capitalist countries, China, India, etc., have not yet directly entered the unfolding conflict, but are waiting, assessing the prospects for its development. We agree with the conclusion that the origin of this military conflict lies in the counter-revolutionary destruction of socialism in the USSR and the restoration of capitalism in the post-Soviet space. The Ukrainian bourgeoisie grew up on the plundering of the economic resources of the Ukrainian SSR, on the seizure of property from the overwhelming majority of the population, just as in Russia. It quickly concentrated this property in the hands of a few oligarchic groups to the level of branch monopolies, and, following the country's economy, it, quote, privatized state power. The contradictory position of these oligarchic groups consisted in the fact that they tried to limit the participation of both Russian and Western capital in the concentration of private property in the country as much as possible. At the same time, the big bourgeoisie simultaneously tried to actively cooperate with Russian oligarchs in economic matters, in the pursuit of high profits through access to Russian energy resources at sufficiently low prices, and to flirt with international capital of the West, as the profits were placed in Western banks and private property in Western countries. To justify ideologically its relative disassociation from the East and the West, the Ukrainian oligarchic bourgeoisie needed the ideology of radical bourgeois nationalism, which also suited the interests of Western countries, especially after the Orange Revolution organized by them in 2004, because of its anti-Russian orientation. It was then that Bandera and Shukevich began to be glorified as heroes in the public consciousness of Ukrainians. For the working class of Ukraine and the broad proletarian masses in towns and villages, the restoration of capitalism resulted in an enormous restriction and limitation of their rights in the process of deindustrialization of the country. However, under conditions of political and ideological disorientation, the working class, trade unions, and leftist parties were only capable of rearguard battles. The discrediting of socialism by bourgeois propaganda pushed the proletariat of Ukraine to narrow its struggle only to economic tasks, and pushed the most qualified strata to migrate abroad in search of better pay. The UCU was directly involved in these class struggles of the 90s and 2000s, striving to preserve the international proletarian revolutionary tradition of the class struggle, and trying to counteract the political opportunism in the communist and leftist movement in Ukraine that grew out of the degradation of the working class. The global financial, trade, and industrial crisis of 2008 and its consequences was a direct precondition for the growing confrontation between Russia and NATO countries in Ukraine. The long-term stagnation of the world economy and all efforts of the leading capitalist countries to shift the consequences of this crisis to the working class and the broad proletarian strata, as well as to the dependent capitalist countries, have shown that there is no economic way out of this crisis within capitalism. The leading capitalist countries, led by the USA, to exit the crisis, switched to direct robbery of some countries by unleashing a series of coups d'etat through color revolutions and local wars under the guise of democratization of countries. This led to a large-scale aggravation of international contradictions and the beginning of reformation of imperialist alliances, aggravation of confrontation of these alliances, including in Ukraine, as well as the growth of radical nationalism in its Nazi and fascist manifestations. The coming to power in 2010 of monopolistic oligarchic groups led by Yanukovych, who was perceived as pro-Russian bourgeoisie, on the one hand increased the cooperation of Russian and Ukrainian monopolies, but only to the extent that allowed Ukrainian oligarchs to keep control of the economy and property in the country. On the other hand, Yanukovych made electoral technology experts from the United States and Great Britain, such as Manafort, his political advisors, who advised him, based on, quote, sociological surveys, to build his campaign for re-election so that in the second round, the leader of the Nazi party, Svoboda, renamed the Social Nationalist Party, Tiagnabok, would be his opponent. As a result, it was the money of allegedly pro-Russian oligarchs that allowed these Nazi groups to grow from marginal groups to become political parties. They were given the opportunity to win local council elections in the western regions and get their deputies into the Ukrainian parliament. For this purpose, Yanukovych did not even cancel the decrees of his predecessor, Yushchenko, granting the titles of Hero of Ukraine to Bandera and Shukevich. However, Yanukovych's, quote, advisors played a different card behind his back. Under their leadership, pro-Western oligarchic groups, supported by US and EU imperialism, carried out a coup d'etat in 2014. The pro-fascist and Nazi organization supported by them not only turned out to be the strike force of this coup d'etat, but were armed by the new oligarchic power and became its strike troops in the form of paramilitary, quote, volunteer battalions. The internal political significance of the Maidan 2014 coup d'etat was the completion of the counter-revolutionary destruction of the consequences of the victory of the Great October Socialist Revolution, which gave the people of Ukraine their first national state in the form of a Soviet socialist state. The post-Maidan government destroyed, with a particular hatred, everything related to the victory of the revolutionary workers and communist movement on the territory of Ukraine and with the establishment of Soviet power. On the other hand, it extolled those who were defeated and expelled during that revolution and civil war, from Petliura and Skoropadsky to Bandera, Shukovich, and other enemies of the working people of Soviet Ukraine. The coup d'etat marked the beginning of the civil war in Ukraine between supporters of the new nationalist government and its opponents, what led to the separation of Crimea and its absorption by Russia in a referendum, as well as to the formation of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, LDPR, which found themselves in a situation of long armed confrontation with the government in Kiev. Although even the participants of this confrontation were not aware of its class nature, but rather as an inter-ethnic one, it was characteristic that all the oligarchic groups supported the post-Maidan government and provided the appearance of legitimacy to this government through their parliamentary deputies. Moreover, not a single oligarch, even from Yanukovych's group, defected to the side of the LDPR, which had been created during the Civil War. In their social composition, especially in the backbone of their armed formations, the Donbas republics were proletarian in nature, but in their political form, they were bourgeois republics and expressed the interests of both the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, who did not accept the radical anti-Russian nationalism of the post-Maidan government and its pro-Western course. Since the formation of the LDPR, the UCU, taking into account their internal contradictions, has been involved in helping the workers and communist organizations of these republics to form their ideological class position. The Russian bourgeoisie has taken a contradictory stance with regard to the LDPR. On the one hand, it provided military and economic aid to the Donbas republics, but on the other hand, it did not politically recognize them, and did not incorporate them into the Russian Federation like Crimea, but went to recognize the legitimacy of the pro-fascist Turchinov, Poroshenko, Zelensky puppet regime, and signed the Minsk agreements with this regime. This did not bring peace to the LDPR, and made the war a latent state on the line of contact for 8 years, thus allowing the Ukrainian government to create a strong and Nazi-motivated army that became a threat not only to the LDPR, but also to Russia itself. The internal inconsistency of the position of the Russian bourgeois state with regard to the LDPR and the post-Maidan government is related to the fact that its economic interests were closely intertwined with both Western capital and Ukrainian oligarchic capital. Russian politicians scolded the Maidan authorities, while Russian oligarchs profited together with Ukrainian oligarchs from the use of pipelines through Ukraine. The ammonia pipeline from Togliatti to the Odessa port plant suspended its operation only on February 24, 2022. Resale of Donbas coal to Ukraine under the Rotterdam scheme. Resale of metallurgical and other products. Exactly the same way, Ukrainian oligarchs, through the mouths of their politicians, were cursing the Russian aggressor, while they continued to make joint profits. It is the economic interests of the Russian bourgeoisie that explain, first of all, why the LDPR so actively opposed the demands of Donbas workers to nationalize the enterprises owned by Ukrainian oligarchs, and why the military operation against the pro-fascist puppet regime in Ukraine was delayed, and only secondarily was it due to the need to complete the rearmament of the Russian army. The real reason for the SMO is that the Russian oligarchic bourgeoisie has realized that it will not be able to economically overcome the consequences of the global financial and economic crisis. It has finally decided to sacrifice the small share of profits that it derived from cooperation with Ukrainian oligarchs and Western capital in order to redistribute spheres of influence in the world economy and seize new markets for its goods, as well as to counteract the growing efforts of NATO countries, led by the USA, to seize Russian territory and gain access to its raw material resources. The war is not in the interests of, quote, Russians, quote, protection of the Russian-speaking population, or, quote, denazification of the Ukrainian state, but it is precisely in the interest of Russian capital, which has sensed the danger and a necessity for the creation of new international conditions to provide further opportunities for profits and the growth of its capital. No interests of Russian, Tatar, Chuvash, or Yakut workers, nor of workers of all other nationalities of the Russian Federation, are embodied or protected by this war. The puppet regime in Ukraine participates in this war in the interest of Ukrainian oligarchs, who have made themselves completely dependent on big capital of the West and NATO, who have turned the Ukrainian army into an advanced military unit of the Western bourgeoisie. The war is not about the Ukrainian nation. It is not about the Ukrainian language and culture. It's not even about European values. It is a war for the united interests of the Ukrainian and international bourgeoisie, which coincide in their desire to destroy the economic and political power of the Russian bourgeoisie. No interests or rights of Ukrainian workers are protected by this war. Both Ukrainian and Russian workers in this war have only the right and obligation to go to the front and die, so that one group of the world bourgeoisie defeats the other and gains more monopoly rights to oppress the workers, both in their own country and in the defeated countries. Thus, the military conflict, which began in the form of a civil confrontation and civil war on the territory of Ukraine, with the beginning of SMO escalates into an imperialist conflict, and thus becomes the beginning of the World Imperialist War. With the beginning of SMO, the parties to the conflict actually become, on the one hand, the Russian bourgeois state, and, on the other hand, the NATO bloc, waging war with the hands of the Ukrainian army, providing it with weapons, ammunition, intelligence, planning of military operations with the participation of its military advisors, training of this army, information propaganda, cyber support, etc. Second, the goals of warfare are changing. If at the first stage of the civil conflict the Ukrainian regime aimed to restore state control over the Ukrainian territories, where this control was lost, then at the second stage it aimed to destroy Russia as a condition for the existence of Ukraine. The Russian bourgeois regime at the first stage declared as its goal only to support the LDPR in the conflict with the Kiev regime, while at the second stage it was to secure the international conditions for the capitalist development of Russia, and to overcome, for this purpose, the opposition of NATO. Only in this context do the goals of denazification and demilitarization declared by the Russian state acquire real meaning. The demand for denazification of Ukraine develops, step by step, into a demand for denazification of the Baltics, Poland, Europe, and the entire Western world, because, quote, all of them are infected with the Nazism of the West, unquote. Similarly, the demand for demilitarization will expand in the same direction as the military conflict develops. In fact, both of these demands are merely a cover for the real imperialist aims of this war. The development of the military conflict in Ukraine has shown that its leading trend is its escalation into an open clash between the two imperialist blocs, Russia and its allies on one side and NATO on the other side. This means the escalation of the war into a nuclear conflict and the emergence of a real threat of annihilation of humankind. It is quite possible that the rising danger of nuclear war could lead to compromises between the opposing parties to the conflict. In any case, it will be a temporary compromise in favor of one of the parties, which will only be a pause for a new resumption of fighting and military actions. For the working class of Ukraine, this imperialist war has the most tragic consequences. It lies on the shoulders of the workers the role of cannon fodder, and the inevitable deaths in the fighting, mass impoverishment, unemployment, complete restrictions of rights and freedoms for the sake of protecting the interests of the Ukrainian big bourgeoisie, the oligarchs, and the interests of the Western bourgeoisie in destroying and robbing Russia and seizing its natural resources. This will inevitably be accompanied by the destruction and seizure of Ukrainian industrial and natural resources, including, in the case of Russia's success, the same fate awaits the vast majority of the Ukrainian petty bourgeoisie. The big bourgeoisie has already bought its children out of the war and taken them abroad, just as it took its capital out. But that's not the main point. The big bourgeoisie is profiting from the war under Zelensky, just as it profited under Poroshenko, stealing finances, making money from reselling weapons, supplying the army with uniforms, food, repair work, humanitarian aid, etc. In war, the bourgeoisie makes billions of dollars, while the mobilized people have to be equipped and fed by relatives, friends, and volunteers, which is clearly not enough. As in peacetime, but even more brazenly, the bourgeoisie is getting rich off of the bones of the working class. The consequences of this imperialist war will be just as severe for the working class of Russia and the countries of the Russian bloc. They are catastrophic for the proletarian masses of all the countries of the world. A world war cannot but have world consequences. Hunger, impoverishment, unemployment, and falling wages are already pacing the planet. But war will drag the armies of many countries into hostilities, turning their workers into cannon fodder too. The consequence of the world imperialist war that began on the territory of Ukraine will be not the liberation from the global financial and economic crisis, but its catastrophic deepening, which in turn, as it already happened in the past, will lead to the emergence of revolutionary situations in a number of countries where contradictions will be exacerbated to the greatest extent. In the context of international economic and political integration, the development of revolutionary situations will lead to the formation of chains of revolutionary uprisings. The UCU sees the way out of imperialist war for the working class not in abstract calls for peace and disarmament, which, at best, can only provide a reprieve from war for the parties to build up forces for an even fiercer clash later, but in the need to eliminate capitalism as a parasitic and destructive social system in which the competition of capital inevitably leads to crises and wars. In the struggle against war, as a struggle against the power of capitalists who wage wars, we bring forward the task of fighting against the capitalists in each of the warring states. Our goal is to ensure the defeat of the Ukrainian puppet regime in Ukraine. We appeal to the workers armed by this regime to point arms against the power of the bourgeoisie in Ukraine and turn the imperialist war for the interests of the bourgeoisie into a civil war of the working class against its bourgeoisie, for the destruction of its capitalist domination in a communist revolution. We appeal to the Russian workers as a fraternal class, bearing all the burdens of war on its shoulders, also suffering from impoverishment, unemployment, and the elimination of fundamental rights and freedoms. Seek the defeat of the bourgeois power in Russia. Turn your weapons against the Russian oligarchs and their political acolytes. We are ready to fight with you to turn the imperialist war into a class war against the power of capital and for the communist revolution. We appeal to the workers of the countries belonging to NATO to stop the threat of the destruction of humankind in the nuclear clash of imperialist war is only possible in a struggle not for abstract peace, but for the overthrow of the power of the bourgeoisie of their countries, who are waging these wars and profiting from them. Work for the defeat of the bourgeois governments and the NATO bloc in this war. Put forward the task of turning the war between nations into a war between classes. Turn the weapons produced by workers' hands not against the workers of other countries, but against the capitalists of your own countries, against their power. Capitalism has existed for 2 centuries as an international system of domination by the bourgeoisie and oppression of workers. The only way to put an end to this worldwide system of exploitation, the source of crises and wars, is to unite the efforts of workers' struggles internationally in an international communist revolution that grows out of a chain of revolutionary situations. The only thing we can oppose to the bourgeois nationalism and its forms of chauvinism and fascism, which pits peoples against each other in war, is proletarian internationalism. We understand the complexity and danger of these tasks, which inevitably cause repression on the part of the bourgeois political regimes. That is why workers and communist organizations will need to develop illegal forms of class struggle along with legal ones in order to set and implement such tasks. The UCU has been forced to conduct its work in illegal forms since 2014. Many workers and communist organizations may consider these anti-war tasks impossible because of their organizational weakness and lack of influence on the working class. However, historical experience shows that a correct and honest formulation of the tasks of the working class in conditions of war, real, not momentary tasks, may not yield success immediately, but will yield gains as the revolutionary situation intensifies. Since the task of destroying capitalist social relations is an international task, the international coordination of workers and communist parties' actions including the joint elaboration of tasks for the struggle against the imperialist war of the 21st century, for the sake of uniting the international struggle against this war, for a communist reorganization of society and world peace, is becoming increasingly important. Proletarians of all countries, unite. Posted at solidnet.org, translation by Sreko Felix Vojtovic. And that's the end of the second statement, our final statement for this video. I think they got it right, and that this is the type of work we need to be doing and supporting as world capitalism, probably much more quickly than any of us is wanting or ready for, plunges us deeper year after year into intense crisis. The time is now, so ready or not, batter up. This means you.